So I then return to the argument that I made in that paper in 2015 and say, what's really going on here isn't autopoiesis, which is something that I'll address in a minute. It's really this concept of sympoiesis, which is a collectively producing thought in motion. And that's the same thing that happens when humans and dogs play together, and lots of other interspecies collaborations about, in particular, man-o-war siphonophores, which some people confuse with jellyfish. So I will talk about that in a moment. So by the way, there's a piece that won the Dancing Poetry Festival contest in praise of the jellyfish I found looking for pictures. Okay, so this is the part like I said, I'm gonna kind of rush through some of this because I am horribly bad at keeping things in the time that I'm supposed to. If you know much about me at all, and you know that I definitely favor the 4E approach and not the cognitivist or traditional approach to understanding the mind. So the 4E approach, as I've always known it, is the embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, but there's also like the emotional mind, the encultured mind. There's probably about 7 or 8 E's that we could add here. So regardless, I tend to focus on the enacted approach, which is what I will get into in a moment. This is opposed to a more traditional view of the mind that sees it basically as this machine that's inside the head that is computational and symbolic and representational. There's tons of good reasons to believe that that's not the best explanation of the mind. And again, that there are plenty of discussions on that I don't need to get into here. I just kind of skip into the idea that enactivism is the best of the E's, and we should talk about that. And Thompson and Roche, their famous The Embodied Mind, which kind of started this all off, I think. And here they're explaining the enactive approach, saying that it has these 2 major points. Perception consists in perceptually guided action, and cognitive structures emerge from the recurrent sensory motor patterns that allow action to be perceptually guided. And of course, like with anything, there's gonna, we can keep breaking down enactivism further, and there's different types and different, arguments about exactly how far we should extend this conception. And I'm not going to worry too much over that. What I am interested in is the autopoietic enactivist approach, coupled with the strong sensory motor view. So these 2 views are not the same, but they have a lot of similarities, and you see people talking about them almost as if they're the same sometimes. I think there's a little bit of overlap. So the strong sensory motor view can be encapsulated with this quote, I think, from Noe, and I really like this part of it where he's talking about how there's no sensation of roundness or distance or tactile or visual or otherwise, unless we're talking about it in terms of our comportment towards that object. So he says, when we experience something as a cube in perception, we do so because we recognize that its appearance varies or would vary as a result of movement. It has a specific sensory motor profile. This is the idea that thought, action, perception are all bound up in one kind of moment. And that's what we mean when we talk about cognition. I like this a lot. I know there are problems with it, but I kind of want to just pull out that part and cherry pick a little bit, that little bit. And then of course the autopoietic enactivist view. And autopoiesis, if it's a term that's unfamiliar to you, I'll just read a little bit from here. Like I said, there's elements of the strong sensory motor view that I like, but I really want to focus on the way autopoiesis is used by enactivists who seek to, quote, ground cognition in the biodynamics of living systems. So autopoiesis refers to the way that a system, an organism, is self-organizing, self-sustaining, and self-creating, but is also relatively stable and predictable, but also dynamically open and constantly changing. It's kind of this paradox, right, of basically us as humans. That's definitely what we are. There's a lot of systems that could count as autopoietic, of course. People like Evan Thompson then use this to show that there's a continuity between mind and life. Then we get into the debates about, well, exactly how far should we extend cognition then? Because, you know, bacteria are autopoietic, trees are kind of autopoietic in this way. And I have addressed this in a paper, And I will just, this is where I really hand wave and say, look, here's what we need. We need agency and adaptivity. I'm not the only one that says this. I'm using DiPaolo and Ward and Stapleton and others that add agency and adaptivity to the mix. So autopoiesis would be seen as kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition for cognition on this view. You need something more, and behind agency would be something like intentionality. And we might talk about minimal intentionality with other creatures, but I think for the purpose of what I'm doing here, there's not a lot of question that humans are cognitive and dogs are. So I don't need to worry about the bacteria tree question. It is an interesting question. Another thing I'll read from the paper that I think is interesting about autopoiesis, and something that Gallagher has argued recently, autopoietic enactivism can explain a variety of interactions, and not just those that occur between living organisms and their non-living environments. So we can talk about the ways in which cognition is inherently intersubjective on this view. Gallagher, for example, has argued extensively that if we think of enactivism as a sort of predictive engagement, we can understand conversations between people in a much more dynamic and embodied way. Meaning itself would be reconceived on this view and is not simply about what the utterances connote or denote, and it's not even about what the other's actions might imply. What a conversational interaction means, Gallagher argues, is largely dependent on how the participants are aligned with one another. And that then depends on environmental and sensory motor contingencies, and something he calls whole body pragmatics. I really like this, whole body pragmatics, and later we'll talk about practical improvisation and its connection to play, playful dyads between humans and dogs. So this is a good start. But I think despite the capacity to explain these bodily pragmatics of intersubjective interactions, I have argued in my recent book that even autopoietic enactivism with this predictive engagement added in still can't account for all the dynamics involved when two agents collaboratively cognize and create together. So an autopoietic system is said to simultaneously sustain and create itself anew. But self-creation is not really what's happening in certain intersubjective collaborations, in particular in dance, as I argued back in 2015, which was like 10 years ago now. I argued in that paper that collaborative projects like improvisational dance, especially contact improvisation, where partners must maintain physical contact the entire duration of the dance, the type of thoughtful actions that emerge in such exchanges are irreducible to either individual partner. They're genuinely intersubjective and creative. They're not entirely planned, but they're also not just thrashing about. If you know Sheets Johnston's work, which is, I borrow from her a lot in that paper, it's kind of this weird in between. And I've sort of recanted some of my views about whether it's completely on the fly. But I think it's complicated, that expertise, practice, minimizing error, all that stuff is at play here, which makes it a genuinely cognitive action on my view. There's a bit of inference going on, like this didn't work, we're falling apart over here. There's some of that, even if it's only implicit and it's not representational in nature, that the dancers are not having moments where they're thinking about these things explicitly, but it's happening in that movement. And this makes it very richly embodied as well. So the movements embody the thoughts, and the interactions themselves are the vehicles of those thoughts. And it's only through intersubjectively engaging that such creative moments of cognitive movement can take place. But instead of utilizing autopoiesis to understand this, I think we should turn to this concept of sympoiesis, which might be new to many of us. It was new to me when I came across it. Strangely enough, came across it in a Donna Haraway book, because my other love is reading about feminist theory and social political philosophy. And she's borrowing it from Dempster, who had a master's thesis where she used it. And it basically translates to making with, or collectively producing systems that lack self-defined spatial temporal boundaries. Information and control are distributed among their components, and they have the potential for surprising change. This concept isn't just used in like critical theory and feminist philosophy. In fact, that's probably the least likely place you'd find it. When I started looking into it, I found it more in the biological world. So I have a picture here of a man o' war. I keep saying man o' war jellyfish because I'm stuck in that mentality too, but it's not a jellyfish, really. It's a siphonophore, which is a colonial creature composed of many, many zooids, which are tiny little hunters themselves, but together they combine and they collaborate so tightly that they create this one organism that's one of the most powerful ocean predators that we know of. So this is a great example of symbiosis. It's closely aligned to the concept of symbiosis, but I think there's something added to symbiosis, which is the idea of collectively making. I mean, it literally makes a new creature, the siphonophore. There's tons of other examples that I could cite, and if I have time at the end, I will talk about more of those, especially leafcutter ants, one of the great examples that I like to talk about. But the thing I'm here to talk about today is dogs, because I actually think dogs are a great example of a sort of a dog-human dyad is a sort of example of a siphonophore in its own way. Okay, so to make sure that I have time to actually adequately talk about dogs, let me get to that. I really want to focus on how humans and dogs play together, because I think that's where we really can see this idea of symbiosis at work, or at play, as it were. So to talk about play is to open up a whole other Pandora's box, like what even counts as play? How do we understand it? Kind of like art, right? Like how do we know it counts? There's some interesting parallel discussions there. We do know from studies of human play that there's a sort of agreed upon catalog of types of play, like object play, pretense play, where you pretend to be something. And there's also just plain physical play, which we would put dance into that category. So dance and play obviously have a connection. It's a sort of playful movement. And we know that play serves a purpose for kids. You know, it teaches them to like learn how to take turns, to understand metaphor, all of that kind of stuff. And then you've got gameplay that even adults tend to still engage in, where, you know, playing chess, for example, has strict rules that you have to learn. Okay, so like there's, you know, the big question of who actually plays, and we think of kids as playing and adults as playing a little bit less, but the boundaries are a lot blurrier than that. And when it gets to non-human animals, the question gets even more complicated because of our worries about anthropomorphism. We don't want to label something as a human-like activity without warrant. And when I write for interdisciplinary audiences, that's a big concern. I have to be really careful what I say to ethologists. They get real grumpy with me. So one of the ways I go about this is looking at these criteria for what would even count as play in a non-human animal. Because, for example, we know that gulls will play like with their food, or at least they are observed to look like they're playing with their food. They're not just eating it, they're like dropping it and catching it and throwing it to each other. Octopi have been observed to play with Legos, right? So there's all these examples. Even reptiles have been observed to do play-like behavior. And we know that dogs play with each other. And I think if you have a dog, you know that you play with your dog, but like as an ethologist that, you know, is going to question, like, how do we know that that interspecies interaction counts as play? So here's the criteria that I've been using, and I think these are pretty good for humans too, right? For it to count as play, it can't just be for survival. It has to be spontaneous. It has to be for fun. It has to be autotelic. This is something Piaget talks about, that it's for its own self. It is for its own sake, and it is the project itself. You're not doing play to get something. You're just playing. It can't be an ethotypic behavior. And it can't be a stereotypical behavior, like my dog chasing its tail or something. That wouldn't count as play. It can be repetitive, and actually play should be repetitive, because that's how you practice certain routines and get better at what you're playing. And I think 5 is really important for every creature that would be considered playing, is that you can't be in a very dangerous situation or super hungry or thirsty or anything like that. So when I think about my dog Tesla here, and whether or not we're playing, first of all, she's doing the play bow right there, which means that she's enticing me to play. But if she brings me a ball, which she always does when I'm trying to work, and she puts it in my lap and I kind of just toss it aside, then she brings it back, and then I ignore her, and she starts growling, and she might even like nip at my ankles a little bit. You know, she really wants my attention. So then I finally throw it for her. And then she brings it back, but doesn't bring it all the way back. She brings it back just to where I can't quite reach it because she really wants me to get up, I think. All of this is like this, it's a whole routine that we go through. It's play, and it fits all these criteria because it doesn't happen when she's really hungry or when she's really distracted by something. If one of the toddlers is chasing her and trying to pull her tail, she's not interested in playing with me. She's trying to get away from them. All of this is to say, I think that these criteria apply to human play as well. So dance and how it evolved and what purpose it served. It might serve a purpose beyond just play in the sense of just pure enjoyment. We know that it does. There's been some great talks about this and how dance can be used for therapy and all of that. But to even be able to count as art or dance, as many anthropologists like Agustin Fuentes has argued about creativity, it evolved when we were at a point cognitively, developmentally, where we were out of danger enough to be able to use creativity for other things, not just solving the problem of how to survive, but just making things, right? So I think other animals do this, obviously. I don't think that I need to convince most of you. I think this is more for my ethologist audience that's always griping with me. Clearly, animals play, and humans and animals play together. I'm going to skip this thing about autotelicity. There's a little tension there about if something's just for itself, but it also causes all these other cognitive benefits. How does that work? And I think the answer is pretty simple. It's just that it's an accident. We started playing and we also started getting smarter and more creative because of it. And I think that's true of dogs too. So basically, what I want to argue is that interspecies play, especially between humans and dogs, is a unique type of play that emerges and is sustained in the interaction itself. When humans and dogs play together, they create together. Play is creative and self-sustaining, but it's not an individual self who's sustaining the play. It's sustained by the dyad. And you see this argument that basically would mean that play would have to be sympoetic under my view. You see this argument borne out in the research on human-dog play that has been done by a bunch of different ethologists out there. I really focus on Bob Mitchell's work and his colleagues because he's got probably the most extensive library of it. So I'll just kind of run through a couple of these findings. They utilize the concept of projects and routines to talk about how dog-human play interactions occur. So a project is characterized by repetitive action sequences during which a player calibrates its control over something. And a routine is, quote, the interactions of projects of the players, either in their simultaneous occurrence or immediate succession. Projects often involve experiments utilized to gauge what variations in behavior might imply or how to gain or lose control over a situation or the participants. So a project could be something like chasing or keep away or fake out, or my favorite, which is avoid fake out, where if you throw the ball for your dog and you pretend to throw the ball, and after a while your dog might catch on and decide that they don't want to be fooled anymore, so they'll come up with a way to avoid that. A routine involves a whole sequence, so that would be something like first chase the dog, next chase object, then chase the person, and then object keep away, and then run away from the person, and then keep away from the person again, and then finally surrender. I mean, this whole thing that I explained with me in Tesla would count as a routine. And it involves a series of compatible projects repeated and enacted at various points to maintain the overarching goal of the project, which we might just call chase. Like with any play, projects can shift and change, and thus routines are both sustained by and help maintain the play projects. So one of the studies that Mitchell and Thompson did, where they paired dogs with unfamiliar people and observed the modes of play that emerged, they did this so that it wouldn't be like pre-planned by the owners or the guardians. The dog's guardians were there to keep everybody calm because the dogs could see that their guardians were there. So the thing that they were looking for here was social play that emerges. The goal of social play is just the play itself. It's not some kind of game that's already pre-planned like agility, like dog agility. This is just playing outside at a dog park. So they wanted to look at the center directedness or the goal, the autotelic nature of the play. So the pairs were given several objects, such as balls, cloth, and rope, and were just told to engage in spontaneous play for an unspecified amount of time. And Mitchell and Thompson recorded the ways the projects and routines emerged and found that routines were much more often the result of compatible projects rather than incompatible ones. For example, the human-initiated project of chasing the dog, so the human started that, combined with the compatible dog-initiated project of runaway, obviously went together pretty well. But if a person initiated throw the object and the dog initiated chase person, this was not a very compatible and sustainable routine. So there's also interesting to note that enticements and deception were observed and recorded. So an enticement would be like a dog bringing a toy close to a person's grasp. But then if the dog brings it there and then runs away just as the person can reach out and grab the toy, this would be kind of deceptive. So these actions were far more likely to keep the routines and projects going. Other things would cause them to sort of stop, if the incompatible projects took place. So this is one study among many that I've talked about. And I think it's really interesting to note that there's a little bit of like pretense play and deception going on potentially. And this also begs a bunch of questions about what are the dogs actually understanding? Do they really understand that they are deceiving? And I don't think we have to even worry about that and just say that it happens to be that the human is getting deceived. Even if the dog doesn't realize that's what they're doing, there's a kind of implicit intentionality there. So Chevalier Skolnikov has argued that it might be better to think of dogs as being aware of the contingencies embedded in each project or routine, rather than having a conception of deception itself. I have this video, and it's probably not going to have the best sound, and that's fine because it's just a movie in the background. But this is my, at the time, 1-year-old daughter engaging in some play with my dog. And I think it's really funny because obviously neither of them know that they are deceiving or that they're creating anything, but they're sort of creating this little game here as they go along. She's, I think, let me get the video to start over. She's learning that the dog likes to chase the ball here. And sort of learning how to toss the ball to her. And I think what's really interesting is that Tesla here is aware in some sense that she can't play the same game with the baby as she can with me. She's got to bring the ball back or she's not getting it back, because there's another video where if the ball gets too far away, the baby loses interest and won't go get it. She's already kind of losing interest now. But I think it's really interesting to see Tesla engaging in that right context. Whereas with me, she'll bring the ball back halfway and insist that I go get it. So she's not doing that with the baby. Okay, so there's cute little baby spam. Okay. So one other thing to think about is the fact that there's a communication going on here, and intentionality, as I mentioned, and it's contentious with animal studies, of course, with ethologists, especially whether dogs are thinking about something. But I think there's reason to believe that genuine communication is still taking place in something even like what I just showed you. One of the ways we could think about is dynamic signaling, and this is something that ethologists talk about. Much of animal communication is arguably non-intentional, but there are nuanced differences between the ways animals signal and why some signals are more successful than others. Indeed, when what the dogs are doing is not the same thing as what an orchid does when it deceives a bee by omitting a fraudulent scent to attract the bee to pollinate. So we know orchids can signal to bees, right? And it fakes them out. But that's not the same thing as like a human and a dog faking each other out in a bout of play. I mean, I think that's one way we could look at the different types of dynamic signaling. The orchid-bee relationship is completely predictable, and as such, the signaling is scripted. In human-dog play, however, as we've seen, the signaling is much more flexible and responsive to variation, just like in, I think, contact improvisation. So when human and dogs play, they often go off script. Another way to think about this is to think about it the way Mead did, which is to call it a conversation of gestures. And he says of his own dog, the very fact that the dog is ready to attack another becomes a stimulus to the other dog to change his own position or his own attitude. He has no sooner done this than the change of attitude in the second dog, in turn, causes the first dog to change his attitude. I mean, the word attitude might be problematic here, but really it doesn't matter. We have here a conversation of gestures. They are not, however, gestures in the sense that they are significant. So again, I like this. This is almost prefiguring dynamic signaling to me that ethologists use. So there's other research on play that confirms this interpretation. Rooney, for example, has found that when humans take specific actions such as bowing and lunging, dogs are far more likely to reciprocate and continue the play bouts. So when humans actually act like dogs a little bit, that's kind of interesting. This effect was enhanced when it was accompanied by vocalizations by the humans. I mean, certain types of vocalizations work better than others. Cordoni and others found that in play between dogs, when there's asymmetrical play patterns increasing, the play duration tends to decrease. So if like one is being more aggressive than the other, and that would prevent escalation into aggressive activity. So actually dogs can de-escalate a situation on their own, as we know. So they conclude from this that dogs make use of a communicative system that depends on a reciprocity of shared play signals. These signals are clearly not linguistic in nature, but they are communicative all the same. So that's the idea of, I think, conversation of gestures that works pretty well. And I think it works pretty well for thinking about contact improv, because you can't really you can't stop and talk about what you're doing. You just kind of have to do it, but you're still communicating in some important way. Okay, how am I doing on time? Oh, I need to wrap it up, right? Okay.
About 3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes. I can do it in 15. Just kidding. So I'm pretty much done, though. I think this brings me back to the point of autopoiesis, because in sum, with all this research on dog-human play, it converges on this idea that genuinely thoughtful action takes place when humans and dogs play together. This is intersubjectively constituted, except the subjects are not members of the same species, which is really interesting. And I think this is why enactivism is best suited to even explain any of this. Play on this view is not the result of, but is rather the condition for all of these unique modes of cognition. But I want to return to the idea that it's not autopoiesis that's happening here, it's sympoiesis. Remember, autopoiesis refers to the way an organism maintains itself while also continually adapting to its environment. So I think it's important that we note that this is, the teleologically stable and dynamically transformative all at once kind of idea is important here. I like this. It's not that we need to abandon autopoiesis, but we need to add to it. So while autopoietic enactivism is compelling in many ways, I think it fails to fully account for the rich social interactions that constitute many organisms' lives. This isn't to say that it's completely powerless when it comes to explaining intersubjective cognition. So I think what we need to do is add to it, sympoiesis. This making with is not necessarily opposed to autopoiesis. Instead, it places emphasis on a different part of the organism world transactions that constitute cognition. Haraway, for example, claims that bounded or neoliberal individualism amended by autopoiesis is not good enough. And her point, of course, is more political, but I think the sentiment is the same, that autopoiesis is good, but not good enough to capture the multitude of ways that organisms collaborate in trans-species manners. One way to apply the concept of sympoiesis is to look at the concept of the holobiont, which is the organism-host system, and a human is a great example of this, where we have a bunch of organisms living inside of us, bacteria and whatnot. A holobiont can be thought of as a network of biomolecular structures that include a host and its associated microbes. What counts as a holobiont is a bit of a debate right now, but I think humans will qualify given what I've read. And an autopoietic account of humans would see them as self-producing systems, but a sympoietic system being collectively producing would be a better explanation, I think, here, that what's being produced is what we think of as the human, but the human's much more than just one individual. And this might sound a little like metaphysical woo-woo, but if you read scientists talking about this, like Merlin Sheldrake, for example, is talking about a conference he was just at, and one of the things he says is it transpired, they're talking about plants, he said it transpired that the chemicals were actually made by fungi in the plant that lived in the leaves of the plants, And our idea of the plants had to be redrawn. Another researcher interjected, suggesting that it might not be the fungi living inside the leaf that produced these chemicals, but the bacteria living inside the fungi. The notion of the individual depended and expanded beyond recognition, and to talk about individuals made no sense anymore. Another analog would be the leafcutter ants and what we might think of as a superorganism. If you know much about leafcutter ants, and I don't have time to get into it, but they have this whole thing going on where they create gardens. They garden and they create these little gardens of fungus where they grow food for themselves by carefully selecting leaves to bring back to their garden. They have hitchhiker ants that help protect them by like fighting off the parasites that might otherwise jump on the back of the ant and all this stuff. And it's just this like wild, super organismic kind of thing that I think is very symbiotic in nature. I think clearly we know that dogs can decouple from humans. So we have this issue of like, well, it's not always the case that dogs and humans are so tightly together. But I think the ants are a good way to look at that and say, of course, the hitchhiker ant there could always jump off the back of the other. But when they're engaged in this project of making a garden, you can't detach. I mean, that the whole thing is constituted by those interactions. And that's what I'm looking at. I'm going to skip this thing about thick descriptions. That's something that is more for the ethologists. I think there's parallels to dance, but I want to get to the end here. One more thing that I think is worth noting that, as I said, Gallagher mentions this idea of whole body pragmatics, practical improvisation. This idea that we're drawing conclusions by making predictions in our actions, even if we're not explicitly doing it. You can see this reflected in constraint theory to talk about play, which suggests that in many activities, participants engage in a form of shared cooperative action and practical improvisation designed to instruct one another in mutually beneficial ways. So I see an obvious dovetail here with what we've been talking about with predictive engagement and enactivism. And so to conclude, this is directly from my paper. This is what occurs between humans and dogs during bouts of play. There are definite constraints, otherwise the activity cannot be properly understood as play. Those constraints are not, however, like the rules of a chess game. They are not represented explicitly in the minds of the players. While it might be possible for the human among the dyad to represent the rules of a game like avoid fake out, it probably rarely occurs during spontaneous play and almost certainly never does for the dog. The constraints are just built into the play, which is itself generated by the practical improvisations each participant performs. As the dyad continues to play, new routines emerge, and each partner learns how to anticipate better the moves of the other, and the goals gradually shift. Mitchell concurs with this interpretation as he notes that one of his studies of human-dog play that, quote, the other's actions are not only required, but offer the possibility of creative responses to those actions. And it's in these close collaborations that we find sympaesis at play, and in turn, creative cognition that is irreducible to either of the participants alone. And so finally, I think what this all implies about cognitive science is that we need to add the concept of sympaesis to the 4E approach. We can understand cognitive misalignments better this way. I think Suzanne talked about this the other day. I really liked it, the idea of cognition being kind of like a strategy for managing failure, right? Instead of this progressive structure for sure-footed mastery. I'm trying to read the quote that I got. That's what it is. It's like managing these misalignments. And we see this in ant navigation. We see it in man-o'-war siphonophores. We see it in dogs playing agility with humans. We see it in dancers, of course. And creativity is a practically improvised act on this view. It's not entirely pre-planned, and it's not 100% spontaneous either. So dog-human play is just one among many examples of this sort of siphonophoric system that I'm calling sympaetic, that creates meaningful cognitive action. Okay, I will stop now.
Yay, wonderful. Let's all give Michele a very big hand. That was very interesting, and I'm sure we all have a lot of questions. Thank you so much for that. That was really great.
Do I just
So you click, there you go. And so like usual, you chat me, yes, clap, 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 clap. Thank you. It's such a shame on Zoom, right? We can't see really or hear or feel the clap in the same way, but we're clapping. As usual, please just chat me directly, either Q or question, and then I'll go down the line. And I see already a bunch of questions popped up, so let's just get right to it. Sean, you're up first.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so one note, and first of all, thank you, Michele. It was really very interesting, I think. One just quick note, when Mead talks about attitude, I think he means by that posture. I think it goes back to the French or something like that. But I really like the notion of sympoiesis, making with, and I have two related questions. One is, what is it that we make with others, or with playing with the dog? Is there something that we're making? So if you use autopoiesis, you might say you're creating yourself or creating the system. But then also, I think people who use the term autopoiesis also suggest that it's not just that, well, you might say that a system might emerge from an interplay, an intersubjective communication process, so that it's not, it's something more than the two individuals, and that's itself creates an autopoietic system. So I wonder if you're getting more or less the same thing with the word sympoiesis.
Yeah, I think that's something I was thinking about that as I was talking, and I've sort of come across this before, that basically if you look at like a sophonophore, like the man-o-war, it is one being, sort of, right? And it in that sense could be considered autopoietic. But then the little zooids that make it up, while they're making it up, we would call that more appropriately sympoetic on my view. But yeah, at some point then you create these super organisms that become themselves autopoietic, maybe even thinking about the leafcutter ants as a self, like it's a super organism. So it's a leafcutter ant plus the hitchhiker ant plus the fungus that it's carrying around plus the leaves. I mean, everything becomes one big organism. This is like literally how scientists talk about it. Some of them, they disagree, but I think a lot of them are happy to call that a superorganism. So it becomes a self, right? It becomes one thing that then could be considered autopoietic. And yeah, I think that there's nothing wrong with that, I guess. I think we could sort of talk about these being context sensitive, depending on what level of information we're looking at. Sympoiesis might be better, especially in the cases of dog and human, or two humans dancing together, that we know those are two distinct autopoietic systems that happen to be coming together in this moment. And in that moment, it's much more sympoetic. But yeah, I would say it's
yeah, something like the difference between sense making and participatory sense making. So, I mean, I would think sympoiesis would be something having to do more with participatory sense making. So, going back to the question of what are you making? I guess one response would be to say, well, you're just making the play itself, because there's no telos beyond that. The other could be that you're making meaning. So I wonder if you think that you're making meaning with the dog.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of like bouts of human play, we're making a game, sort of, which could be the same as making meaning. It's like the play is making more play. So, because there's a little bit of tension there when I said that the play is what sustains and creates itself. But then, yeah, there's a sometimes completely new game, or whatever you want to call it, a project that emerges from that. And if it gets repeated enough, like it becomes a thing that my dog and I engage in over and over again, day after day. So I suppose that could be one answer, but meaning could be, for the dog, I mean, it's hard to say this without anthropomorphizing too much, but for the dog, it could mean that this is like a new routine that I like to play, and I'm expecting you now to do this again. I've seen this happen with my dogs at home, so they come to expect.
Yeah, there's an affective dimension too, so it could be an affective meaning of some sort. Okay, thanks. Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, Petronilla.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Michele. Thank you. That was very fascinating. I'm just trying. I'm curious about this notion of sympoiesis and in relation to in relation to cognition. I mean, when does this system, or this dyadic system, can you speak about cognition? can you speak about, do you speak about cognition in this, like collective cognition between dog and human, it seems, but I can imagine many other like symbiotic systems, like, I don't know, a mother breastfeeding a baby, where you have this very intimate sort of connection, and something like symbiosis, but I wouldn't speak about cognition. So I was wondering what makes cognition out of it, so to speak.
That's a good question. I think definitely mother-infant interactions are interesting to me right now. I've been looking at kind of how that the modulation there and the what am I looking for? The regulation is exogenous for a baby, and so it really depends entirely on the mother or the father to emotionally, especially regulate in the first few months of life. And that maybe meaning, like what Sean just asked, meaning is created in that symbiotic activity of the baby understanding everything's okay because mom is looking at me in a certain way. And I think that counts as like the beginnings of cognition for the baby. I think we would want to say that, and it would be affective too. So affective cognition. I think there's a lot to be done with affective cognition here too. Just I've been looking at the way collective emotions function, even in like online exchanges, when you get people kind of like building up this group affect based around some kind of shared cause or meaning. And that might count as a symbiotic form of cognition. But then even like collaborative exchanges, I didn't have time to really read into the paper that I've written. And Sean talks about this too, of the way communication and just two people talking together could could effectively create a sort of cognitive moment there, right? Where we like stumble upon some kind of idea together. And that's at the end, I was rushed, but I was talking about this concept of scribbling and bibbling that I've seen used by animal researchers to describe how ants are kind of bumbling around and they're testing out things, and that's how they navigate. It's not like they have a map and then they just go. They kind of like run into stuff and they're all over the place. And I like this connected to what Sean talks about with conversations are like this. Sometimes you just kind of like bump into things and you get misaligned, and then you try to work your way back to an alignment where you understand each other. And I think that's kind of a symbiotic act that involves cognition too. I don't know if that helps.
I was more wondering whether you don't run the risk of like everything becomes cognition in a way. So where do you draw the line between? I mean, of course, it's not easy to answer, but I think that's one risk with this idea.
Yes, and I definitely had to address that in this paper that I just finished with, similar critiques that, if you're not careful, you can look at a bunch of trees all connected up in a network as symbiotic because they're all communicating, they're dynamically stimulating. And I kind of had to wave my hands at that in this presentation, but I do get into it a little bit more in the paper where I talk about how there's got to be a kind of, even if it's minimal intentionality or minimal capacity for something like mind reading to happen between two agents. And I know that's contentious too to talk about mind reading, but there's some really good research in animal cognition about minimal mind reading that goes on between animals, non-human. And I think something like that's required. And I don't think trees would pass that test. So we would at least be able to like shave off cognition at that level. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Hailey, you're up next.
Hi, I hope this isn't too naive a question. This is completely new to me, but I have dogs and I've had a cat and I've had a baby, and I've always wondered about their intentionality. And one of the things I've wondered about that I thought was kind of beautiful in the dog being kinder to the baby in some way by bringing the ball to her is how to handle over control by the more powerfully minded of the group. Like if you have two dogs, and one's not measurably more intelligent than the other, then you can sort of imagine that it might be balanced. But when your dog is presuming when they put the ball a little farther away, that you're going to get up out of your chair, that you're a friendly person. You could go completely, you could commandeer the game in some terrible way as a human, where it's not symbiotic, and where you're completely in control and the dog is not. And so I'm wondering how these differences and abilities would play out. And I think about this sometimes in contact improvisation between able dancers and disabled dancers. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts you could share on that.
Maybe. I think a lot of the research that I was kind of rushing through, that Mitchell and others do, and then of course I mentioned the stuff by Rooney and Cordoni that talk about the mutual reciprocity that occurs when projects are compatible. And I mean, figuring out when you have compatible projects is tough, but with the dogs, at least we can look at it as a pretty simplified version. When you have, a dog getting too aggressive or dominating or refusing to even do give and take at all with the tug of war game or something, the other dog will just sort of naturally back off, and it de-escalates so that there's not an actual aggressive interaction. And I wonder if that kind of framework could be used to look at, human dancers that are having trouble with kind of, navigating expertise, or one thinking they have dominance in the choreographic moment or something like that, but that you have incompatible projects that, there's a misalignment, I guess, of communicative intent there. I'm not sure. I'm still not answering your question, I know, but at least that would be the beginnings of how to understand what's happening and then how to fix it, is kind of what you're asking.
No, that's helpful, because I'm really just gesturing at some, vague thoughts, and so some guidelines as to how to start thinking about it is all that I need. But thank you.
Okay, great. Megan, you're up.
Hi, thank you. That was super new and interesting for me. I'm wondering if you've thought about the idea of symcoesis and how it might differ between, like, I know a lot of times in contact improv or in like with dogs or children, it's like a one-on-one or a very small group situation. And I'm thinking about things like social network theory or dynamic systems theory, where the group is much larger. And like you might have different facets of an organism or different facets of an organization happening in different times and like in different literal, like physical places, and how that, if it translates to that, or if that's like totally far off and not related, how you see it fitting into that sort of a larger system.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of expertise in this, so I don't know that I can speak about it much, but I mean, definitely dynamic systems theory is something I'm sympathetic to. And I think are you talking about kind of like asynchronous?
Yeah, like it could be like there's different parts of the organism or the like large group of people over, in this realm doing their own thing. And at the same time, there's people over here and they're part of one large dynamic system or social network or whatever, but they're like doing different things at the same time as part of the same larger entity. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Hi, I'm watching a conference. I'm watching, listening.
The only like relevant thing I can think of right off the top of my head, because I'm actually working on this, is to look at dynamic exchanges online in activist groups. So I've been like thinking about how certain social movements happen online, like the Arab Spring, for example, and there were like different components of that all over the web, all over the world, right? But people were coming together under one common, I guess you could say, cause. And in certain communities, you see I found some arguments by some social theorists about emotional entrainment online and asynchronous communication, which is really fascinating, that there can be this like buildup, almost like a escalating reciprocity interaction here, there, and then somebody writes an article and shares it here. And then like, you just look at these nodes in this big network and it just keeps building up this movement. And each individual is affected by this too, because they continue to buy in to the system or continue to participate in the system. And I think that would be an interesting like analog to a dynamic system that you might think of as just a single organism. But I don't know. This is like new stuff for me that I've just been looking at, so I can't really.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I just thought I'd try to see if it related at all.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't know if I would want to call that sympoiesis or if it would just be dynamic systems, or if maybe all dynamic systems are symphoetic in some way. I haven't really worked all that out yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And actually, this makes me think of a corporation as like a classic example of that kind of system that does things at different times. But that's a different discussion. Julia, I think you have a question.
Yes, I do. Thanks, first of all, for your really interesting talk, also new to me, and love talks that take me down different routes. So I wondered about the conversation, also the interaction that you had with Eli, about the basic, so what I call basic mechanisms that might be cognitively enabling this interaction. And I wondered if you had looked into how other species are able to imitate each other or imitate other, let's say, across species, because some of the neurodevelopmental work would say that a basic movement simulation mechanism is like the precursor that little children develop before being able to play. So it's the most basic kind of play, this affect sort of simulation and almost contagion of movements of others. It's just imitating it, like can't even help it. And then it starts to become more deliberate. I imitate you to see if you imitate me, and this sort of play. So that on one side. And then I was made aware of a really cool type of study that showed that dogs catch human yawn, and yawn being one of these behaviors that have been studied as, this basic movement simulation or contagion mechanism. So I'm just going to put it in the chat. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's more like a comment. So because I wondered what you thought about it, like something very cognitively low level that enables that actually, for example, across species, dog, human, we can play. Maybe because we can simulate each other in a way. Don't know.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about the contagion stuff with dogs, and this is stuff I had to just completely gloss over, but in my book, I have a whole chapter on all of the current research on dogs and their capacities that have been sort of overlooked until recently.
Yeah.
The contagion stuff, what's really fascinating, at least from everything I can tell, they will mimic us, but not so much each other. So like if a dog yawns in front of another dog, it's not going to care. But if I yawn in front of my dog, it's more likely to yawn contagiously. And we know that dogs track faces, human faces, the way humans track human faces, but they don't track dog faces that way.
Wow,
So
that's crazy.
They have
cool.
The left gaze bias, so that how we like look to the left and then the right, and that's how we like measure a face for its affect. Dogs do that to us. But they don't do it to each other. And only dogs that have been raised in a kind of Western-centric way, like so street dogs in India are not going to do this left gaze bias as much as, say, American dogs. So
we're even westernizing, weirderizing the dogs. My goodness.
I mean, Brian Hare, one of the researchers that I follow a lot, he says that dogs are like the super species that have figured out how to manipulate us so well that they are the second most populous, creature, and they just proliferate, and it's all because they've hacked into us. So there's something about the way that they're so, that's what got me interested in this. They're so tightly commingled with us that they literally use us more than they use each other. And if you look at wolves, they don't look to humans for help as much as dogs do. And they're like quite literally the same creature, except that, a few generations of breeding has changed them, and they can still interbreed. And why is that? It's because this dynamic interaction with us that's just so beneficial to them. I know I kind of went away from your question, but I don't in terms of the mimesis or whatever you might want to call it, like the imitation without thought behind it. I think there's something to be studied there, because I have seen with my own children, like some of the first things that my daughter did before she could even talk, which she'd go, you know, like she's being the dog and she'd crawl around and like pretend to sniff. And I don't know if she knew that she was doing that. Like if she knew she was being a dog or if she was just being a dog. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
super interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. Very cool inspiration.
Okay, so we're unfortunately at time. I have more questions in the queue, but maybe you can either talk to Michele online later, or when I leave the room open at the end of our time today for a little bit, or email her. You've got more questions. This is really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. One more time, let's give her a hand.
thank you.
So please make sure that you get some fresh air, drink some water, stretch whatever body parts doesn't hurt, get coffee if you have to, and we'll be back again in about 15 minutes. So thank you everyone again for being here, and we'll see you again shortly.